Brought to you in part by Volkswagen. Experience German engineering the Volkswagen way.
And now A&E has your international ticket to the best in award-winning filmmaking. It's A&E's Screening Room.
There is one family that personified the American dream. For decades, the story of America revolved around the lives and deaths of its members. At times, in their fabulous lives, they appeared the very masters of time and chance. Their triumphs and their tragedies have touched millions. These are the Kennedys. This is their story. Their political first. Jack, the youngest man ever to be elected president. Bobby.
That's all right. Don't get him excited. This is my first trip to Europe, and I was very excited. I couldn't even sleep last night.
The first American to serve in a brother's presidential cabinet. And when Teddy was elected, the Kennedys became the first family to elect 3 sons to the United States Senate. They brought a family approach to American politics. One for all, and all for one. Politics, the game with the highest stakes, was there to be mastered and won. A way to celebrate the Kennedy joie de vivre. They made it seem, in a world struggling for survival, that anything could be done, that anything was possible. What about setbacks and calamities? After one family tragedy, a reporter asked Brother Bobby if now the Kennedys would give up. He replied, "The Kennedys intend to stay in public life. Good luck is something you make. Bad luck is something you endure." And it was that view of life and death that sustained Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. in his hours of grief. His firstborn, Joe Jr., crashed to his death in World War II. Daughter Kathleen killed in a plane crash. Jack, the president, assassinated in a Dallas motorcade. Bobby murdered in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. Joe Kennedy, crippled by a stroke, endured the bad. Time and chance had dealt with him and his family in a manner that rivaled the tragedies of the Greeks. Joseph P. Kennedy's grandfather was an Irish peasant. He came to America during the potato famine of the 1860s in Ireland. Joe's father was a saloon keeper and a ward-level politician who eventually served in the Massachusetts legislature. Joe would remember to his dying day the signs, "No Irish Need Lie." But he got a better start than most Boston Irish of his day. He was educated with the elite at Boston's Latin School, then at Harvard. And when he married Rose Fitzgerald, the daughter of Mayor Honey Fitz, it was the union of 2 politically powerful Irish families. With the help of his father and father-in-law, Joe became the youngest bank president in the United States. People took notice of it. That fellow has something, they said. But not the right people. Not the people who mattered. To the lodges and the Cabots and other proper Bostonians, Joe Kennedy was an upstart. A brash, aggressive, money-making Irish Catholic. Joseph P. Kennedy couldn't join their country clubs. His wife, Rose, educated in Europe, couldn't join the Junior League. His children were not accepted as equals by the offspring of the Boston Brahmins. But Joe Kennedy believed in the American dream. He was out to prove it true. He had wit and charm and brains, and he had luck. During World War I, he became an executive in a shipyard, and there had his first encounter with Franklin Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The war over, he charmed his way into a firm of stockbrokers, quickly became a master of the marketplace, and took off for New York and Wall Street after the big money. Here again, he learned and earned, but seemed still to be looking. Then came Hollywood. He refinanced major studios, produced films, met Gloria Swanson, formed a friendship and a company with her. They were together frequently. There was a scandal. And all the while, he kept piling up money. A man of substance as the 20s began to roar, he was a millionaire many times over when they crashed. He had the foresight, or was it Irish luck, to liquidate his holdings the year before the market collapsed. His fortune was safe. The family spent summers on the Cape and winters at Palm Beach. For the Kennedy family, life was unchanged. But Joe Sr. was worried about his fortune. Everywhere there were signs of chaos. The recovery promised by President Hoover was nowhere in sight. Close to 1,400 banks failed in 1930 alone. Soon, 16 million workers were unemployed. Foreclosures and evictions stirred ugly moods. Mobs in Washington. Riots. Upheaval. The rage of the people might bring everything down. He saw Franklin D. Roosevelt as a man who could save it all and set out to help him. Roosevelt needed a solvent supporter, a man of substance, and an Irish Catholic to neutralize his Irish Catholic competitor, Al Smith.
Not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Roosevelt welcomed him. Kennedy contributed $25,000 to the campaign, loaned the Democrats $50,000 more, collected another $100,000 from his millionaire friends. But still, he was an outsider. His money was welcome, but the idealists in the party were skeptical of a stock market operator. When Franklin Roosevelt became president, Joe Kennedy expected to be Secretary of the Treasury. FDR kept him waiting for a year and a half. Kennedy thought he had been taken. Finally, he was named chairman of the newly created Securities and Exchange Commission. A stroke of Roosevelt's genius. Kennedy was perfect for the job. He knew all the tricks to catch the tricksters.
Against all enemies.
The SEC established, he resigned to work on FDR's re-election. Then came the real reward for an Irishman from Boston. Roosevelt made him ambassador to the court of St. James.
All right there, boys, it's late.
He loved England. His large family was a source of fascination to the English. Nothing could have pleased Joe Kennedy more.
Just arrived in England after a very pleasant trip. I'm looking forward with great anticipation to my duties here and to renewing acquaintanceship with many old friends. Thank you very much.
What about the family of 9, Mr. Kennedy?
We're not wishing to add to the housing problem of England and make it any worse than it is. I'm bringing them over in installments. 5, 2, and 2.
Thank you.
Of all he had done, all that he possessed, nothing compared with his love for his family. There were plans for them, especially as nothing would obstruct the path of his children. Everything would be placed at their disposal. What was needed was the proper upbringing, a good education, the will to win. Failure was not tolerated. Destiny must be actively pursued. If you used your head and you worked, you were sure to win. Competition created strength, assured excellence. The Kennedy children were in constant competition. It was an essential part of their upbringing. They were taught to rely on one another, but also on themselves. Joe Jr., with his dad so often away, was almost a surrogate father. But he and his mother worked within guidelines set by the father. Loyalty to the family, allegiance to one another, respect for, but not fear of those above. Joe Jr. was the star of the family, and he patterned himself on his father. His ambitions, his conservative views, his pugnacious personality. He was bright, he was determined. He sometimes boasted that if his dad didn't precede him to the White House, he, Joe Jr., would be the first Catholic president.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue in a moment.
It was now the latter part of 1938. No time for personal plans. Hitler was becoming more and more menacing. Each day brought new threats of war. In England, Prime Minister Chamberlain was convinced that war could be avoided. He said that Hitler, despite his ruthlessness, was a man to be relied upon when he had given his word. This was a policy of appeasement. Ambassador Kennedy, influenced by Chamberlain, agreed with this policy. He also felt that the German war machine could not be beaten. Hitler took Austria, then was handed Czechoslovakia. He threatened Poland. The terrors of Nazi genocide, wanton murder, and destruction became commonplace. It was during this period, while Hitler swallowed up his neighbors, that the ties between Kennedy and Roosevelt became strained. Some Roosevelt advisors thought Joe talked too much.
It may be that we've talked too much about international relationships. It seems that every time I meet somebody now, we spend all of our time discussing the terrible state of the world and the disaster hanging over our heads. Certainly, we hear very little else at public gatherings. In the first place, of course, let us not forget that we still have peace.
The Nazis invaded Poland. England declared war. Kennedy phoned Roosevelt at 4 a.m. in Washington, awakening the president with the news. Upset and gloomy, he was predicting chaos and anarchy, no matter who won. Kennedy's isolationist views had put him on the wrong side of history and in direct opposition to Roosevelt. His days in London were numbered. Chamberlain was replaced by Churchill. Churchill and FDR maintained direct communication. Ambassador Kennedy, deliberately bypassed, resigned.
I am returning to Washington to report to the President. I leave England at this time with real regret. When I went to school, we were taught that the great courage of the world was Spartan courage. But your exhibition will certainly earn you a great page in history, and we'll have it talked about for centuries to come. British courage. My hat's off to you.
Despite bad feeling, Kennedy returned home in time to endorse FDR for the third term. But he still defended his own views.
A label used as a smear against certain citizens who favor keeping America out of war is the word appeaser. I have been called one, and here is my answer. If by that word, now possessed of hateful implications, it is charged that I advocate a deal with the dictators contrary to the British desires, or that I advocate placing any trust or confidence in their promises, the charge is false and malicious. If I am called an appeaser because I oppose the entrance of this country into the present war, I cheerfully plead guilty. And so must every one of you who want to keep America out of this war.
Kennedy had many reasons for opposing the war. Two important ones were his eldest sons. Then came Pearl Harbor. His sons enlisted. Kennedy reversed his position. He fired off a telegram to Washington offering his services. But Roosevelt had no place for Joe Kennedy.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Kennedy's public life had come to an abrupt halt. But the dream remained. His sons remained. It wasn't the end. It was just a setback. His son Joe would go off to fly dangerous missions. Son Jack to the Pacific, commander of a PT boat. Courage became a Kennedy trademark. The greater the danger, the more Jack and Joe offered themselves. Then word came that Jack was missing. 2 weeks later, he was found, alive, on an island. And soon he was home, a war hero. Joe Jr. volunteered for a dangerous mission. It failed. Joe Kennedy had lost his first son. The plane, full of explosives, had blown up shortly after takeoff. But Jack was safe. The war ended. Jack wasn't sure what he wanted to do. He considered writing, but politics attracted him also. It was a way of doing something about the world. His father helped him decide. He ran for Congress. As Joe put it, I got Jack into politics. Joe Jr. was dead. It was Jack's responsibility to run. He didn't want to. Felt he didn't have the ability. But I told him he had to. It was like being drafted, Jack explained. My father wanted his eldest son in politics. You know my father. And Jack grew in the role. By now, Joe Kennedy himself was back in public life, working on a commission to revamp the federal government. In his 6 years as a congressman, Jack's politics were basically conservative. He was anti-communist, an advocate of the status quo. He occasionally showed his toughness and independence. In one case, he fought the American Legion for their opposition to a low-cost housing project in a highly sensitive political issue. Building his image with care, he wanted to be more than a congressman. Henry Cabot Lodge was running for re-election to the Senate from Massachusetts. The Kennedys thought he could be beaten. Lodge, confident of his own election, would be running the Eisenhower campaign.
As we approach the Republican National Convention, it becomes increasingly apparent each day that Eisenhower will be overwhelmingly nominated on an early ballot. If I were guessing, I would say the second or third. One thing I will flatly predict, now.
Here was an opportunity for Jack to become a national figure and to beat out the elite of Boston, the Cabots and the Lodges. As Lodge played national politics, Kennedy zeroed in on the local issues. But things were not going well. The polls showed Lodge ahead. A strong hand was needed, one that could handle all the elements, including Joe Sr., whose old political cronies were out of touch with the times. The obvious man to take over was Bobby. He gave up his job in the Justice Department to run the campaign. Working tirelessly with consummate skill, they built a new kind of political organization flooded with youth and vitality. Soon, the tide turned. On the national level, Eisenhower was enchanting the voters. Lodge was right there beside him, listening to the cheers. Ike was headed for the White House, but Lodge was headed for disaster. Jack Kennedy had become a relentless campaigner. Each day, he looked more and more the winner. Each Kennedy, a reporter wrote, takes pride in the achievement of the others. This was a tremendous asset. Yet one man troubled the Kennedys and millions of other Americans for different reasons. Joe McCarthy, junior senator from Wisconsin, a political opportunist who capitalized on fears of communism. Professor Owen Latimer spoke out against McCarthy and his methods.
That these innuendos have had on the success of my mission and the foreign policy of the United States. I therefore conclude that Senator McCarthy's charges and insinuations are not only false, but utterly irresponsible, and under the circumstances reveal a shocking disregard for the interests of our country.
That's what he was to some, yet to others he was a hero. But for a politician, no matter which side you were on, McCarthy was no man to ignore, no man to cross.
For failure to answer the questions that have been propounded to him.
If Irish Catholic McCarthy spoke for Lodge, Boston Irish Catholics might just listen. Joe Kennedy considered McCarthy a friend. McCarthy had dated his daughter Eunice, employed Bobby. Kennedy had contributed to McCarthy campaigns. He asked Joe McCarthy to please stay out of Massachusetts. He did.
Bobby, my brother Bobby, who managed the campaign, perhaps he could give us some idea, more up to date, of what the final figures were.
Well, I think that from what we got up to about 20 minutes ago, that we were winning by about 70,000, and with about 100,000 more votes to come in, and I think that plurality is remaining.
That's out of about 2,250,000.
Yeah. So I think that's about 5% of the vote.
Good, fine. Well, I guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Bobby?
I am, Jack.
The distance between Boston and the White House had shrunk significantly, and the lodges had been set back. It was a double victory. The following year, Jack married. He had met Jackie before the 1952 campaign, but the plans were kept secret. Jack was getting grand publicity as Washington's most eligible bachelor. National magazines competed to feature him on their covers. The announcement of their engagement was postponed so as not to spoil a cover story. Soon, Jackie was part of the Kennedy clan.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue in a moment. Returns to Kennedy's Don't Cry.
Jack was becoming a national figure. He backed Adlai Stevenson for the Democratic presidential nomination. Stevenson, recently divorced, felt a Catholic spokesman would be useful. He also wanted an up-and-coming young Democrat. He chose Jack to make the nominating speech. The 1956 convention brought real prominence.
Fellow delegates, I give you the man from Libertyville, the next Democratic nominee, and our next President of the United States, Adlai E. Stevenson.
At this point, Jack made a wrong move. Adlai Stevenson threw the choice of his vice president to the convention. Jack jumped for it, against his father's advice, and he missed. Joe Kennedy thought Adlai couldn't win and didn't want the defeat blamed on Jack. Jack was disheartened.
Mr. Chairman, with thanks to this great free Democratic convention, I request that my name be withdrawn in favor of my colleague, Senator F. Barber.
Hello. Surprise. He didn't like losing, but in the process, he had tested himself on the national scene and set his aim directly on the presidency.
Ladies and gentlemen of this convention, I want to take this opportunity first to express my appreciation to Democrats from all parts of the country, north and south, east and west, who have been so generous and kind to me this afternoon.
The following year, his daughter Caroline was born. The baptism was a public event. Then Jack ran for re-election to the Senate. As usual, the family was there.
At home with the Kennedys. An informal visit with the family of Senator John F. Kennedy. Mrs. Joseph P. Kennedy.
Good morning, friends. 6 years ago, when my son Jack was a candidate for the Senate, we had this little half hour on television. Many of you, most of you I think, seem to have enjoyed it. And so we arranged to have it again this year. Of course, there have been a great many changes in the family. The girls, who helped so much before, have been married and have children of their own. And so they have not been able to help Jack as much. But we have a charming addition in the person of Jacqueline, Jack's wife, who has been campaigning with him during the last few months, and whom I know many of you have met. Won't you tell us, Jacqueline, a little about your experiences?
I've enjoyed campaigning so much, Mrs. Kennedy. Since September 15th, Jack and I have been traveling through the state trying to meet as many people as we can. Your youngest son, Teddy, who, as you know, is campaign manager, set up the schedule for us last summer, and now he joins us whenever he can get away from law school on weekends. We visited 184 communities, and I think slept in nearly every city in Massachusetts. And we must have shaken hands with nearly everyone in Massachusetts, too.
Well, congratulations, Jackie. And congratulations to Jack that he found a wife who has so enjoyed the campaign. Of course, with us it was a little different because we were born into a political atmosphere. But with you, it was quite a new experience.
I know. Jack has been ungallant enough to say in speeches that you've been campaigning for 65 years. I realize, of course, that he refers to Grandpa Fitzgerald carrying you around in his arms when he was mayor and you were a tiny baby.
Well, that is not quite true, because in those days, of course, the women did not have the vote.
First question is, how many babies did you kiss in this campaign? Well, I didn't kiss enough, I guess, but I did manage to... There didn't seem to be much desire on their part, but in any case, we saw a lot of mothers whose hands we shook in.
The publicity was reaching the people and the politicians.
You are a Democrat.
But there were hurdles on the way to the presidency. Jack's youth, his inexperience, and he was a Catholic. No Catholic had ever been elected president. The liberal wing of the party felt nagging doubts about him. Jack's liberalism seemed too recent. But as Jack said, Hubert's too liberal and Lyndon is a Southerner and less liberal than I. We all have handicaps. Maybe this is the time. All the Kennedys were enthusiastic. Joe Kennedy enjoyed the action too, though he had to stay in the background while helping to push his son to the presidency. He explained privately, we're going to sell Jack like soap flakes. As early as 1957, he was in New York lining up political bosses. He called Chicago Mayor Daley. Kennedy had vast holdings in Chicago. Daley signed up. And the candidate, once considered a poor speaker, began to show the rhetoric and style that would stir men's souls.
The Eisenhower Peace and Prosperity conceals a dangerous attrition, a period of stagnation and status quo, while America becomes second best in all of the vital things that count. And while they talk about prosperity, it is an abundance of courage that we need, and not merely of goods. We have the most gadgets,
and the most gimmicks and the longest tail fins and the biggest television sets in our history. But we also have the worst slums, the most crowded schools, and the greatest erosion of our national resources and national will that we've ever had. In short, I believe that our party and the time have met. We, the Democratic Party, has its greatest opportunity and responsibility in all of its long history. For it is a time of decision, a time of leadership. It is, my fellow Democrats, a time for greatness.
Let's make this number 5 for April 5 and victory on April 5. And meanwhile, we'll single the man from Minnesota. He's for you and you and you. Fights for all the people, not for just a few. On the farm, and get him applause there, Miles.
Jack had to enter the primaries to prove his vote-getting ability. And that route was blocked in Wisconsin by Hubert Horatio Humphrey.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest lack. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got high hopes. He's got high hopes. 19...
This was Humphrey's backyard, full of farmers he had helped for years. A Humphrey victory here would be a major blow to Kennedy's campaign, if not the end. But there was no other way. The convention delegates, the party pros, and the liberals all had to know Jack Kennedy was a candidate who could win.
I do believe it is, because I think that if I were unsuccessful here, I think it would be very difficult to be nominated. And I think if we win here, I think we'll be in a stronger position.
K-E-double-N-E-D-Y. Jack's the nation's favorite guy. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got high hopes.
It's been a good campaign in many ways, even though we've had a little difficulty getting our opposition to want to discuss the issues.
Mr. Humphrey and I may differ on, because I think we agree on many things. What I think we're trying to decide here, what the people of Wisconsin are attempting to decide, is which candidate can best lead the Democratic Party in the election of 1960.
Jack was victorious in Wisconsin. Then it was on to the primary in West Virginia. Another fight against Humphrey.
Well, I hope we're going to do well. I guess we'll know better by the time the votes are counted.
I cannot come to you with great wealth. I cannot come to you with a political machine, if that's what you want. I don't have either. But this is not something that should be handed around as if it were a gift or a plaything. It is the most responsible job in the world, the most difficult one. And whoever seeks it, and whoever gains it, whatever may be his name or his political party, must be prepared to give his life to it and to his nation.
I want to say, however, to you folks here, the senator...
There was a surprise in store for the Kennedys in West Virginia. Tests indicated an easy victory. However, Kennedy's Catholicism had been overlooked. The voters in this primarily Protestant state soon expressed their hostility. The politicians followed, and the press latched on with front-page stories.
I would like to say that all 340 pounds of Matt Reese is for this man here for the presidency.
Some of Jack's advisors, including his father, wanted to ignore the religious issue. Jack thought differently.
The question of a candidate's religion seems to be discussed more and more as the primaries go on, and it has been brought up here in West Virginia. I must say I don't agree with this. I think the United States Constitution settled this whole matter of religious freedom far better than we can today. It provided it in two ways. First, in Article 1, it provided for the separation of church and state. And secondly, Article 6, it provided that there shall be no religious test for office. I hold that view. I came to West Virginia of my own free choice. It happens to have probably the fewest of my co-religionists of any state in the United States. But I'm running for the presidency, not on this question. I'm running because I think it's a most serious time in the life of this country.
The overriding issue of the campaign became religious tolerance. A West Virginian could demonstrate his tolerance only by voting for Kennedy. The issue drawn, the tough Kennedy team attacked Hubert as a puppet and tried to cut off the flow of his campaign money. Led by friends and relatives, the Kennedy organization numbered in the thousands.
And he's got that big debate tonight at 8:30.
Joe Kennedy asked his old friend Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. to help. FDR was a hero to West Virginian miners. Franklin Jr. told the voters that Jack, not Hubert, was in the tradition of FDR.
No money for television, no money for printing. I say, where are the buttons? We have no money. So I say, all right, we'll just knock off the whole day, cancel out the program, and we'll get on this telephone. I'll call my friends in Minnesota. We'll call them in New York. We'll call them in Washington. We've got to raise the money.
The investment and the strategy paid off. Humphrey had been swamped. By convention time, Kennedy was the obvious frontrunner. But Adlai Stevenson and Lyndon Johnson were still in the way. An enthusiastic last-minute Stevenson rally at the convention failed. Only Lyndon Johnson remained to be beaten.
I'm a candidate for president and only a candidate for president. I have no idea that anyone will consider me for vice president because I think it would be very difficult for a man to hold both jobs.
But Lyndon wasn't really organized for the Kennedy Blitz, for what he came to label Jack Kennedy's political genius. The strategy, propelled by the zeal of Bobby Kennedy, proved invincible. Bobby wouldn't take no for an answer. He begged, threatened, cajoled, and charmed. He browbeat and intrigued. He was a man obsessed. His singleness of purpose brought a reputation for ruthlessness and enemies, among them Lyndon Johnson, who had no great love for the Kennedys. Bobby tried to keep Johnson off the ticket. He thought Johnson would harm Jack's chances. Jack's appraisal was different. Johnson, he decided, was of utmost importance to the ticket. Without him, it would be difficult to fight Nixon in the South. The liberals might object, but this was a risk he had to take.
After giving the matter careful consideration, I felt it as my duty to accept. It's with my knowledge and consent that I'll be nominated this evening.
There were those who said it required considerable pressure to make you determined to join Mr. Kennedy. Is that true?
No, that is not true. I'm very proud to be on the ticket with Senator Kennedy. I don't submit very easily to pressures, and I've had no pressures in this connection.
We Republicans know, as I know, and as you know, that a new star has been born in the leadership sky.
A&E returns to Kennedy's Don't Cry.
We know it will not be easy to campaign against a man who has spoken and voted on every side of every issue. Mr. Nixon may feel that it's his turn now, after the New Deal and the Fair Deal. But before he deals, someone's going to cut the cards. That someone may be the millions of Americans who voted for President Eisenhower, but would balk at electing his successor.
We've traveled within and outside of the United States over 500,000 miles, mostly by air, but a great deal by automobile, some by even ox cart, by boat, and virtually every type of transportation. There have been over 3,000 speeches made in campaigns and all over the world. As far as number of countries, we now have visited, since becoming, holding the president office, 55 countries over the world. We met a lot of interesting people, some very, very important people. In fact, in running down the types of people we met, we found 35 presidents and 15 prime ministers, 2 emperors, 6 kings, of course a number of queens, 3 or 4 sultans, and so on, up and down the line.
We should rebuild our military strength, not because we want to declare war, but because we want to declare peace. If there is any lesson of the summit, it is that the communists believe that the military balance of power is shifting in their direction.
Why was it necessary for a presidential candidate in Brazil, in the middle of his campaign, to pay a visit to Castro? Why was the United States unable to get an indictment of Castro by name at the last meeting of the Organization of American States? Because the power and prestige of the United States, relative to that of the communist world, has diminished in the last decade. Because these people wonder whether the future belongs to the Castros and the Khrushchevs and the neutralists who are turning to hostility. They wonder whether the future belongs to freedom. Now that is the great issue of 1950.
Can you imagine if this country elects a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and elects Dick Nixon, Republican President of the United States, and then Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn go over to meet with him as the leader of the Congress and sit down with Dick Nixon, who in 1952 said Adlai Stevenson had a degree from the Cowardly College of Containment, in 1954 called Truman a traitor, in 1960 called me a liar, in 1960 called Lyndon an ignoramus. Lyndon says he called me one. No, I say he called Lyndon one. He called me rash, improved, reckless, naive, and uninformed, but he called Lyndon an ignoramus. Do you think he's going to go down and work with him? I don't care how many rescue squads they send to help Dick Nixon travel around the United States. I don't care if Cabot Lodge and Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater all prop him up and push him forward, and I don't care if they add Dewey, Landon, and Hoover to advise them how to win.
The people of the United States in this last week have finally caught up with the promises that have been made by our opponents. They realize that it's a modern medicine man show, a Pied Piper from Boston, and they're not going to go down that road.
For the presidency of the United States because it is the center of action. I run against a candidate who reminds me of the symbol of his party, the circus elephant, his head full of ivory, a long memory and no vision, and you have seen elephants being led around the circus ring. They grab the tail of the elephant in front of them. That was all right in 1952 and 1956, but there's no tail to grab this year. It's Mr. Nixon himself, and I don't believe he will secure an endorsement of the majority of citizens of this country at a time of change.
Jack Kennedy was elected President of the United States in 1960. The victory margin was slim, less than 120,000 of 68 million votes cast. Johnson had been an inspired choice. Mayor Daley and his political machine a blessing. Minorities had been instrumental in the victory, but it was going to prove difficult to meet their expectations. In the realm of foreign policy, Jack Kennedy spoke boldly.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Under Kennedy, government became a family affair. Brother Bobby was appointed Attorney General, and that caused eyebrow lifting. But then Teddy, just turned 30, announced himself a candidate for Jack's Senate seat. The older brothers were embarrassed, but their father backed Teddy's decision. And then there was Sergeant Shriver, a son-in-law.
First time in 2 years, when the phone rang, was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you've got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, well, all right, I will. So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, listen, you've got to come down here to Washington to run the Peace Corps. And I said, well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps. And he said, well, that's all right, neither does anybody else. And I said, but yes, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends? He said, listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. If it turns out that way, it's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend.
First, I want you to meet the lady who started it all. I feel that parents should be responsible for their children, so we really can blame our first guest for the way hers have turned out. May I introduce to you the head of the most successful employment agency in America, Mr. Joseph. The story of a typical American family from Hyannisport, a small town in Massachusetts. And the next seems like carrying coals to Newcastle because she is our secret weapon, our universal ambassadress, whom the people of France affectionately call Madame la Présidente, Jacqueline Kennedy.
The credit Rose Kennedy was accepting belonged in large part to her husband, who no longer attended public functions. At 71, his son in the White House almost a year, Joe Kennedy suffered a crippling stroke. His capacity to speak had been impaired, but he could still think clearly. He spent his time keeping track of his successful sons, even helped Teddy when he ran in '62.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue in a moment. A&E returns to Kennedy's Don't Cry.
Fidel Castro and Cuba had been a campaign issue for Kennedy, what he called incredible Republican blunder, inaction, and failure in foreign policy. Kennedy would deal swiftly and firmly with the likes of Castro. Within months, Kennedy's campaign rhetoric was put to the test. The anti-Castro invasion of the Bay of Pigs had been planned under Eisenhower. Kennedy reviewed it, had his doubts, but approved the plan nonetheless. The American-backed Cubans didn't have a chance. They were flattened on the beach, forced into ignoble surrender. It was a monumental fiasco from start to finish. It made Kennedy seem rash, naive, imprudent, and uninformed, and in his area of self-proclaimed expertise in foreign policy.
I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them.
Within months, Kennedy kept an appointment in Vienna with the head of the Russian state. Some had suggested the summit conference be postponed to allow the Bay of Pigs to recede into history. Kennedy elected to go. The meeting in Vienna, planned to ease East-West tensions, achieved the very opposite. The city of Berlin, divided between East Germany backed by Russia and West Germany backed by the United States, was a sensitive spot. At the meeting, Khrushchev proposed an immediate treaty affecting Berlin and threatened to sign unilaterally if Kennedy did not agree on his terms. Kennedy was firm in his answer. Berlin would not be abandoned, and he would not accept an ultimatum. Khrushchev said that the Soviet Union's decision was irrevocable. He would sign in December. Kennedy answered, "It will be a cold winter."
I will tell you now that it was a very sober 2 days. There was no discourtesy, no loss of tempers, no threats or ultimatums by either side. No advantage or concession was either gained or given. No major decision was either planned or taken. No spectacular progress was either achieved or pretended.
The East Germans built a wall in Berlin. The decision had been made to end the mass escapes across the border to the west. Kennedy mobilized the reserves and brought troops down the Autobahn from West Germany into Berlin. Americans were told, frankly, that atomic war was possible.
A dictator has a position that the leader of a free society does not have, and he can continue to push. If he miscalculates, and that's the great danger in all of these matters in dealing with a dictator, if he miscalculates, the world could be destroyed. I would hope that within the last few weeks he's come to the realization that the president and the free world are willing to use nuclear weapons to preserve our position in Berlin, to ensure that the people of Berlin remain free and that we have access to that city.
Some Americans took their government's advice and built fallout shelters. After months of negotiation and jockeying by both leaders, Khrushchev announced that since the Western powers were showing understanding in trying to solve the German problem, he would not insist on a treaty signature before December. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But the contest between the great powers was not over. The Russians, striving to extend their influence and increase their nuclear capabilities, took a drastic step. There was still fear in Cuba of an American invasion. Russia was Cuba's ally. Khrushchev, known for his willingness to gamble, sent missiles with nuclear warheads. Rumor of their existence in Cuba had been circulating in Washington for weeks. Conclusive proof reached Kennedy during the congressional election campaign. From the beginning, Kennedy said he must respond to the Russians. One had to act. But what were the options? He convened a special group of high-level military and civilians called the XCOM. Gathered at the White House, they asked themselves, what really had changed? In an atomic war, a missile launched from Moscow is as deadly as one launched from Havana. Maybe nothing had changed, and therefore nothing should be done. Military advisors said, bomb out the Cuban missiles. Congressional leaders were talking military action. McNamara proposed a blockade of Cuba to prevent delivery of any more Russian arms, a gesture intended to give the U.S. time to make its position clear and to give Khrushchev time to reconsider what he was doing. Bobby Kennedy supported the blockade strategy. He opposed an airstrike, saying Sunday morning sneak attacks were not part of the American tradition. He led the way towards more moderate action. The blockade was ordered, and Khrushchev told that the missiles in Cuba must be removed. The hours crept by, the world poised on the edge of atomic holocaust. Then 2 letters came from Khrushchev, each offering to remove the missiles if the United States met certain conditions. The offer of Khrushchev's first letter was accepted. The United States would formally and publicly agree not to invade Cuba. But as for the demand in Khrushchev's second letter for the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey, Bobby explained that President Kennedy had been anxious to remove these missiles for a long period, but there would be no public commitment to remove them. Khrushchev accepted. The Russian ships turned around in mid-Atlantic. The missiles were withdrawn, the bases dismantled. The United States, led by its president, had been firm, forbearing, and prudent. Domestically, Kennedy was faced with many problems, but none so difficult of solution as civil rights. It had been 100 years since black people had been emancipated, but they were not full-fledged citizens. Kennedy moved on many fronts. He named blacks to government posts. He had to use troops, finally, to get James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. And he had to find a way to keep the peace in Birmingham, a peace disturbed in great part by Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses.
I have instructed Secretary of Defense McNamara to alert units of the armed forces trained in riot control and to dispatch selected units to military bases in the vicinity of Birmingham. Finally, I have directed that the necessary preliminary steps to calling the Alabama National Guard into federal service be taken now, so that units of the Guard will be promptly available should their services be required.
And as violence raged, men like James Baldwin could not contain their anger.
6 kids were murdered in Birmingham on a Sunday and in Sunday school in a Christian nation, and nobody cares.
Legislation, late in coming, was being pushed, but Martin Luther King and other blacks were not satisfied.
They go talking about these little levels of progress that we see here and there, and they say, you know, you've made great progress. Aren't you satisfied? No, we are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied as long as Negro boys and Negro girls are forced to live life without dignity and without respect. We will not be satisfied.
There was no easy solution, as America was yet to see. Anxious to strengthen America's image abroad, Kennedy went to Berlin. He was pushing for accommodation with Khrushchev and an end to atomic testing.
2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was, Civis Romanus sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
It was time to get moving on the 1964 campaign. Toward the end of November, he went to Texas. On November 22nd, 1963, he spoke in Fort Worth.
And as a result of the effort which this country has made in the last 3 years, we are second to none. In the past 3 years, we have increased the defense budget of the United States by over 20%, increased the program of acquisition for Polaris submarines from 24 to 41, increased our Minuteman missile purchase program by more than 75%, doubled the number of strategic bombers and missiles on alert, doubled the number of nuclear weapons available in the strategic alert forces, increased the tactical nuclear forces deployed in Western Europe by over 60%, added 5 combat-ready divisions to the armies of the United States, and 5 tactical fighter wings to the Air Force of the United States, increased our strategic airlift capability by 75%, and increased our special counterinsurgency forces, which are engaged now in South Vietnam, by 600%. I hope those who want a strong America and place it on some signs will also place those figures next to it.
Within hours, he was in a motorcade in Dallas. The crowds were mostly friendly.
We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. At this point, it looks as though it could have been 1 or 2 or even all of the people within the car may have been the victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know.
He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You were as he was waving back, the shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat.
It fell to Ted Kennedy to break the tragic news to his father. A nurse who saw Joe Kennedy after his son left him found him with tears in his eyes, tightly gripping the covers of his bed. Jack Kennedy had been president 1,065 days. Eventful, critical, dramatic days. The survival of the world at stake, and he at the center of it all. Young, handsome, regal, full of life, vigor, brilliance, and wit. And now, he was gone. So much promised, so much unfulfilled. Throughout the world, he was mourned. And it seemed his untimely end was more than the wanton murder of a man. More than the senseless slaughter of a president. It seemed as if hope itself had been assassinated in Dallas.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. Concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen of the coming of the Lord.
At 7 p.m., Dr. Martin Luther King expired in the emergency room as a result of a gunshot wound in the neck. And further details will have to be obtained from the coroner's office.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus, and he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
He tried to heal, but within 62 days, he too was dead. Thousands of train-side mourners lined the route to say their last goodbyes, and his words took on new meaning.
We will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. Dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that.
I know that it was a source of the greatest strength to him to know that there were thousands of people all over the United States who were together with him, dedicated to certain principles and to certain ideals. No matter what talent the individual possesses, no matter what energy he might have, integrity and honesty he might have, if he is by himself and particularly a political figure, he can accomplish very little. He wanted to do something for the mentally ill and the mentally retarded, for those who are not covered by Social Security, for those who are not receiving an adequate minimum wage, for those who did not have adequate housing, for our elderly people who had difficulty paying their medical bills, for our fellow citizens who are not white, who had difficulty living in this society. When I think of President Kennedy, I think of what Shakespeare said in Romeo and Juliet, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. But I realize as an individual and really
those were the words Bobby had chosen in Jack's memory. Now it was Ted's turn to speak of the dead.
My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he was to us, what he wished for others, will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue in a moment.
In '68, Hubert Humphrey made it to the top of his party. He had come a long way since West Virginia.
My fellow Americans, my fellow Democrats, I proudly accept the nomination of our party.
There was an attempt to get Ted Kennedy on the ticket as vice president, but after much sober thought, Ted refused. He had first defined the limits of his role as the new Kennedy patriarch, the father of 3 and Uncle Ted to Jack's 2 children and Bobby's 11. He was examining a new political role, one unhampered by the shadow of either Jack or Bob.
President Kennedy defended America against the extremists. George Wallace is in league with them. President Kennedy fought for legislation that would ensure every citizen the right to vote.
Known to the public as the younger brother, Ted began to emerge in some ways as a better politician than either of the others. Fellow senators had already seen that Teddy, unlike the brothers, seemed better prepared to deal with the Senate on its own terms. And he was heir to the Kennedy style.
My brothers believed in the dignity of man. How can those who stood with them support a man whose agents used cattle prods and dogs against human beings in Alabama? So it is not enough that this movement be defeated. It must be repudiated for the health of our country and our future as a nation. And I hope that the American people will take this opportunity to cleanse the stain of hate from American life.
We're going to succeed. We're going to win.
But Hubert's determination was not enough.
I'll tell you, it isn't going to be like 48. Lots of things have changed. You remember that was the year that Harry Truman won by giving him hell. Well, it won't work this time. Because just remember, I'm sure you will all agree with this, that it's one thing to give him hell, but it's something else to give him Humphrey, believe me. Back it to him. Back it to him.
Richard Nixon, victorious, had vanquished Humphrey and outlasted the Kennedys. While the Nixons settled into the White House, Ted and the remaining Kennedys addressed fundraising dinners to pay off Bobby's campaign debts.
What'd I say? Sorry about that, Senator. Nice fellow. The senior senator from Massachusetts, Edward Moore Kennedy.
Let me say, first of all, how much all of us appreciate the fact that you are here this evening. All of us in the family, I think, owe a special word of thanks to particularly Steve and my mother, because they have been so attendant to detail, they've been so efficient, and they both use the same hairdresser. minority leader. You fellows want to run him? I think Steve would actually be a great candidate in the state of New York. He's Irish Catholic, great name. He wears Italian suits. How can he lose? It is true that Steve will not be a candidate for governor next year because my mother is going to be. But let me just say, I wanted particularly Mother to come this evening because, as perhaps many of you remember, during the course of the hard-fought Indiana campaign, Mother came out there to Indiana. She made a remark at that time that someone asked her about the expenditures of funds, and Mother said, well, why shouldn't we spend it? It's our money. And so, Mother, it's particularly appropriate that you come here this evening to find out whose money we really were spending out of it. Finest mother any family's ever had.
Rose spoke often of Bobby.
Bobby, of course, would come to see his father in usually the evening at Hyannis. And he would always have one of the youngsters with him, another couple by the hand, his dog coming close behind. What joy he brought us. What a making void there is without him. We admired him. We loved him. And the world is indeed bleak without him. A devoted husband, a beloved son, an adored brother. I know I shall not see his like again. I envy you people who are watching this generation and have a chance to inspire them and help them become leaders. I envy you because it is through your guidance that they can gain the courage, the foresight, and the ideals, the dedication to ideals, which can be stimulated and mobilized and lead so much to the success of this country, this land which we love so well, Jack used to say. You have wept with us in times of sorrow, and you have rejoiced with us in times of triumph. For all these tributes of affection, we are deeply grateful.
Then, in July 1969, tragedy struck again. On the island of Chappaquiddick in the dark of night after an evening of partying, Ted Kennedy drove his car up a narrow bridge into the deep water. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, a former secretary in Bobby's office, drowned. Kennedy survived, but he had failed to report the accident to authorities until 9 hours later.
The car that I was driving on an unlit road went off a narrow bridge which had no guardrails and was built on a left angle to the road. The car overturned in a deep pond and immediately filled with water. I remember thinking as the cold water rushed in around my head that I was for certain drowning. Then water entered my lungs and I actually felt the sensation of drowning. But somehow I struggled to the surface alive. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. Although my doctors informed me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, I do not seek to responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or on anyone else. There is no truth whatever,
to the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening, there has never been a private relationship between us of any kind. I know of nothing in Mary Jo's conduct on that or any other occasion. And the same is true of the other girls at that party that would lend any substance to such ugly speculation about their character. Nor was I driving under the influence of liquor.
That winter, as a new generation of Kennedys walked the beach at Hyannisport, Joe Kennedy, so many joys turned to ashes, gave up his life. But for the others, life went on. Within months, there was a campaign for re-election to be waged, and won. Teddy faced his responsibilities and dealt with them.
Well, I try and work hard in the United States Senate, and I work hard at what I'm doing, and I'm working hard in this campaign. But really, this is more of a benefit really to me. I've valued the contacts I've had with people over the course of this campaign. I've learned a lot about their concerns and their interests. I think it's important for a public official to have this kind of a campaign, of rubbing shoulders with the people, to listen to their concerns, to see the impact of a cut in Head Start program, or when they're cutting out a milk program, or the fact that the low-income housing or middle-income housing just isn't being built, or to meet the hundreds of senior citizens who can't get into a senior citizen program. And this humanizes the issue. It is now more than 10 years since John Kennedy told us to ask not what our country could do for us, but what we could do for our country. That was a phrase and a feeling that fired the imagination of an entire generation of Americans and of people around the world. For all our citizens, rich and poor, north and south, business and labor, we brought a new awareness of the purpose of America. Brought a new respect for our basic civil liberties. We brought a new compassion to the strong. We brought new hope to all the weak. The idealism we had before may be just as spark today, but it is still there, waiting for the call that can fan it back to life.
Next.
Each evening from December to December, before you drift to sleep upon your cot, think back on all the tales that you remember of Camelot.
To introduce the man who stood closer to him in times of crisis and in times of fun than anyone else, his brother, Robert Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy eulogized his brother, groping for a hold on his own future. It was expected that he would take up the torch. He was the heir to a growing legend. His brother had promised so much. Events had cheated him, had cheated those who had depended on him. It was inevitable that Bobby take his brother's place.
Mr. Chairman.
His mountain climb symbolized his plans for the future. In 1964, Bobby Kennedy was thinking about the vice presidency. He took a world tour, first to Germany.
President Kennedy clearly saw the qualities of citizenship that have made your city a password of freedom. He saw clearly the quality of strength.
Then to Japan. And Indonesia. Then Rome. And Poland. Everywhere he reminded people of his brother. But Lyndon Johnson had no desire to have his administration sandwiched between Kennedys. He had other plans. When he refused Bobby a place on the ticket, Bobby ran for the Senate against Kenneth Keating of New York.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we all know what we're here for. And I want to announce at the outset that I will not be a candidate for the United States Senate from Massachusetts.
Teddy Kennedy was up for re-election that year. His plane crashed on a campaign tour. The pilot died. Kennedy broke his back and was near death. Some people talked of the Kennedy curse. With his wife's help, Ted waged his campaign from his hospital bed.
I'm confident that I'll be on my feet. I've been given these assurances by some of the most able and capable doctors that we could possibly have. And so I'd probably refer that question probably even more accurately to their opinions. I'd take their word for it.
You have no doubt yourself.
No.
When would you hope to take your seat?
Rose Kennedy campaigned for both of them, as did the other family members.
That I've never had before. To introduce my son on a platform. I can tell you, of course, a great deal about him. I used to spank him with the ruler. But he really has been a great joy, and he does work very, very hard.
I want to thank my mother for the kind introduction. That's what we've gotten down to this campaign after some of these polls came out that we were not doing too well. We took mother. Yeah, I know. I'm going to tell them people. I was up in Syracuse, and the county chairman in Syracuse had been opposed to my nomination, George Van Lingman. And then he's one of the great county chairmen. He just didn't happen to like me. But then he spent a day with Mother, and he wants to run her. Yeah, I know. Well, why don't you give your own speech? See, that's it. We don't have... My brother and I never... The reason she's never introduced any of us before is because we never go on the same platform with her. We couldn't possibly compete with that.
Bobby won.
Political opponents
Teddy
are
won.
saying that you only plan to use New York State as a stepping stone, that your real goal is still the White House. Do you expect that you will be back in the White House?
Well, I think there's somebody there. And in my judgment, I keep reading that, and I never see any statement by him that he's willing to move out. So I think he's going to be there quite some period of time.
Meanwhile, the war in Vietnam had become America's war.
To withdraw from our responsibilities would endanger free men and free women everywhere and would bring the hope for peace to an end. I don't believe that you want to do that. I believe in victory. The victory of love over hate. The victory of man's hopes over man's fears. The victory of freedom over tyranny. And I believe you believe in that too.
That I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against it not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America. There can be no great disappointment where there is no great love.
I'm going to remain on as a United States Senator representing the state of New York, and I'm going to support the Democratic ticket in 1968 of President Johnson Hubert Humphrey.
Boo! Bobby, strongly opposed to the continuation of the war in Vietnam, was cautious about declaring his candidacy for president. He was also influenced by advisors who felt he should bide his time until 1972. The suffering in Vietnam was continually on his mind.
And having judged that the war in Vietnam was a mistake without precedent in our history,
Senator Gene McCarthy was bolder. He decided to challenge Johnson in the primaries, and many of Bobby's supporters rallied around him.
we cannot stop with that judgment, but we're called upon to search out the causes and the conditions that led us into it. And this may require us to make the hardest and the harshest judgments about our national assumptions, about the institutions that embody them, and about some of the leaders who have become the spokesmen for this cause.
Bobby isn't ready to announce his candidacy for the presidency yet, and he doesn't think anyone else should announce either. But you can be sure that Bobby will be in Chicago for the convention next year. He's the only delegate who's reserved 4 floors at the Conrad Hilton. And if he isn't nominated, he'll be the only father who will come home one night with 40,000 balloons.
For 20 years, first the French and then the United States have been predicting victory in Vietnam. In 1961 and in 1962, as well as 1966 and 1967, we have been told that the tide is turning. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can soon bring our troops home. Victory is near. The enemy is tiring. Once in 1962, I participated in such a prediction myself. But for 20 years, we have been wrong. The history of conflict among nations does not record another such lengthy and consistent chronicle of error as we have shown in Vietnam. It is time to discard so proven a fallacy and face the reality that a military victory is not in sight and that it will probably never come.
Are you advising him to run? Oh, I've had conversations with him, but obviously these are personal matters.
Do you think he should run?
Kept between the members of the family. Come on, be careful of what you're saying to them.
In New Hampshire, McCarthy scored the incredible upset. The war had made Johnson far more vulnerable than almost anyone had imagined. In the midst of the McCarthy campaign, Bobby decided to run for the nomination.
I run for President of the United States, not because of the answers of the 1960s, or not because I was involved in government during that period of time, or pleased to be involved in government, but I run for President of the United States because I believe in the ideals of this generation of Americans, and I think we can do far better than we've done in the past.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
We can make changes. We can deal with the violence, but we can also make changes so that everybody has an equal opportunity, no matter where they live.
Once in the race, Bobby began to gain on McCarthy. He had started late, but he was closing the gap and was headed for a Chicago convention and victory. His hat was in the ring, but like Jack 8 years earlier, he wouldn't put it on.
When you fall down over my ears, then you'd be embarrassed if you gave me a hat that was too big. Let me try it on in home.
They couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Try it on in front of the mirror, quietly. I'll meet you back. I'll meet you in Washington.
I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
Kennedys don't cry.